Hi everybody, it's Stefan Molyneux from Freedomain Radio. Hope you're doing well. So here's a slightly technical but very good example of a rebuttal to one of my arguments that is very instructive in many ways. So this, it always starts when somebody's being weirdly aggressive, they always use your last name. Molyneux says, right? And whenever somebody barks my last name at me, I'm either in trouble in boarding school when I was a kid, I'm being drafted, or I'm facing a passive-aggressive person on YouTube. But this person says, Molyneux paraphrase. So this is his characterization of my argument regarding self-ownership. He says that I'm saying denying self-ownership is contradictory because doing so presupposes the truth of self-ownership. So he's paraphrased my argument. Now, when somebody paraphrases your argument, usually it's a straw man. In other words, I say very clearly what my argument is, but when somebody paraphrases it, they're usually changing it into something that's easier for them to dismiss. And then he goes on to say, granting this, since the denial of self-ownership is a contradiction, and since the negation of a contradiction is a tautology, that means that self-ownership is tautological and is no more a fact about reality than any other tautology. Example, if the moon is made of green cheese, then the moon is made of green cheese, is a tautology. It is true whether or not the moon is actually made of green cheese and therefore has nothing to do with facts about the real world. If self-ownership is not a purely tautological concept, then its negation is not a contradiction either. I'm afraid that this refutes Molyneux's quote proof that self-ownership is a fact. Now, you'll see this technique used quite a bit in debates. And what it is you say, I'm going to paraphrase this argument, I'm going to introduce a logical contradiction or logical fallacy. I'm going to say that my paraphrasing of my opponent's argument fits this logical fallacy, therefore my opponent's argument is invalid. That's not really how logical debate works at all. It's sort of like saying, hey, I've got a great business plan. I'm going to type up a business document. I'm going to scream the word profit at it until money comes out of my eyeballs or Bitcoin's out of my ears. Go Bitcoin. So, if he says that my argument is a tautology, then he actually has not understood my argument. What I'm saying is that we own ourselves, we own the effects of our actions. And that to oppose someone who says that is to affirm that they have made an argument that they are responsible for, that they made with their body, that they have control over. And it's the first two words here that are the clue. He says, Molyneux paraphrased. In other words, what he's saying is, Stefan Molyneux made an argument that he is responsible for, which I am rebutting to his argument, which he created through his control over his own body. Now, you cannot say, I'm going to rebut Stefan Molyneux's argument while rejecting the concept of self-ownership, because how does he know it's my argument? Because I created it and I'm responsible for it and it needs to be corrected. That's my argument. That to oppose somebody's self-ownership while ascribing their argument to themselves and their body, which they use to create the argument that they have control over, is to accept self-ownership. It's not a tautology. So, I mean, I've used this example elsewhere, but if I try to convince you that language is meaningless, I've automatically shot myself in the foot because I'm relying on the fact that language has at least some capacity for meaning to tell you that it's meaningless. If I argue language is meaningless, that makes no sense because I'm choosing specific words that rely on language having some meaning in order to communicate that it's meaningless. Like if I said, I'm probably swore in Klingon, but that would be a meaningless statement. But the moment I pick specific words based upon their meaning, I can't argue that language is meaningless. Similarly, if I send you an email arguing that emails never get delivered to the right person, never, ever, ever, then the form of my argument denies the content of my argument. This is really, really important. You have to look at the form of arguments before evaluating their content. If I say language has no meaning, then the form of my argument relies on the fact that language has meaning to communicate the content that language has no meaning. If I send you an email saying emails never get delivered to the right person, I'm relying on the fact that emails get delivered by the right person, to the right person. So I'm relying on the fact that emails do get delivered to the right person in order to convince you that emails never get delivered to the right person. So you look at the form of the argument before evaluating the content. So that's really my argument. And again, anybody who responds, who identifies my argument as mine, is establishing that I have self-ownership and I'm responsible for the effects of my actions. And they, in bringing their argument to bear on mine, are creating a counter-argument that relies on self-ownership, them being responsible for the effects of their actions. My argument is better than Molyneux's argument, blah, blah, blah. So forget about the content. When you first look at an argument, you want to look at the form that the argument is taking and all of the metaphysical and epistemological assumptions that are embedded in the very act of making a debate or making an argument. So saying that self-ownership is not rooted in reality at all, I don't know exactly how to respond to that other than, there's places on the internet you can go where you can examine how the body works. And the fact that the brain, has a brain stem that connects to the spinal cord that has nerve endings. If somebody can pay you $1 million to lift your own arm, well, you're going to be up $1 million. If somebody tells you to lift the arm of someone in India who doesn't know that they're being videotaped and have it, tap themselves on the head 34 times, you will not be able to get that $1 million. Why? Because your brainstem has control over your own extremities. It does not have direct control over other people's extremities. You can threaten them or whatever, but you don't have to, say to your arm, hey man, get up off that table and tap my bald head 34 times or I'm going to paint those nails really gay and go to a biker bar and then you're going to get hurt, right? So you don't have to threaten your own arms or bribe them, So I don't know how you bribe your hand now that I'm not a teenager, but your brain is connected to your brainstem, connected to your nervous system, which is how you control your own body. That's not a tautology. That is not a self-referential item that adds nothing to a value. Like Coke is it. What's it? Oh, it's Coke. Oh, yeah, that's a tautology. But the physical reality that our brain is in control of our body. Now, you could say, of course, that nobody's brain is in control of their body. But then you wouldn't try and change someone's mind, right? I mean, you don't try and argue an avalanche. Like you don't try and argue a mountain out of to not have an avalanche when you're skiing, because that's just a matter of, dominoes and physical principles and so on. So this is an important thing to see, and you'll see this quite a bit. Restatement of argument, logical fallacy, an assertion that the argument conforms to the logical fallacy and therefore is incorrect, but without actually uniting it together. And one of the ways you'll see this, of course, is to paraphrase, or, so if I get this correctly, to sum it up. So what Molyneux is really saying, rather than actually quoting the argument back, it's not that hard. My stuff's recordable. You can rewind it. I've written some stuff down, also books all over the place. You can get it at freedomainradio.com/free. So be very careful when people restate your argument, introduce a logical fallacy, and say, therefore, false. That is not anywhere close to a logical analysis. And look at the form of the argument before analyzing the content of the argument. And look at all of the assumptions that must be built into the very act of debating before you start evaluating content. Everybody wants to jump over the form of the argument and start debating content. But about 90%, I really, really believe this, and after 30 years of debating this stuff, I know with fairly strong certainty that about 90% of philosophical arguments can be solved immediately in the moment by looking at the form of the argument, rather than simply vaulting over the form of the argument and examining the content. Like the question of the validity of sense data, since all arguments rely upon sense data, you got to see them or hear them or whatever it is. I guess you can feel them with Braille, or you could have them tapped into your ears in Morse code. I don't think you could taste an argument, although socialism often tastes like old fish. But that's a different story. So the sense data, since you rely on sense data to communicate your argument, then you have to accept at least some validity of sense data. You have to accept some validity of the meaningfulness of language. You have to accept empirical reality. You have to accept the existence of other people. And you have to accept self-ownership and being responsible for the effects of your actions. All of that is embedded and more in simply the very act of debating. And also, you have to prefer reason over force, since you're not just going out and beating someone up who disagrees with you, but you're attempting to reason with them. Therefore, reason must be superior to force. Truth is objective, because you're saying, don't conform to my will, but conform to an objective truth. Reason and evidence is more important than faith, superstition, inner ramblings, or whatever it is. All of this stuff is embedded in the very act of having any kind of debate. And if people focus on that and accept all of that, then they can actually get on to the real job of philosophy, which is to not buck about definitions that are implicit in the act of debating, but to accept those and move on to actually solving problems. So I hope that helps. freedomainradio.com/donate to help out the show. And we're going to do a couple of these, so stick around.